participants are starting to shuffle in. And looks like we're live on the live stream now. So welcome back, everyone. It's just after 1 here, and we're getting started with our keynote plenary session. I'm excited to introduce our first keynote speaker, Mark Keynote. He is a professor at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and this afternoon he's going to be discussing biological invasions and ecosystem resilience in urban ecosystems and beyond, applying current research in Canada. So with that, Mark, I will let you take it away.
Thanks so much, MacKenzie. Thanks for having me here. I'm just going to share my screen again. Can you confirm, MacKenzie, you can see my screen?
Yeah, I can see it, and it's in the correct mode as well.
Great, thanks a lot. Well, thanks everyone for joining and hearing me talk today. It's great to be here virtually. Certainly, it would be nice to mingle with people in the halls over coffee, but this is the world we live in. So I'm going to talk today about biological invasions in urban systems, and I'm going to talk a bit about the research that we've been doing on a number of different fronts that span from basic understanding of why certain species are successful in urban systems, why cities are important to invasions, to understanding the impacts and some of the, I'll say a few brief things about management. But I do want to just quickly acknowledge a number of collaborators and past students and postdocs who've contributed to some of the intellectual components, as well as data components of this talk. And a lot of what I present here is informed by contributions from these wonderful people. So cities are unique places. They really don't have any historical analog that we can look to in order to understand the functioning of these ecosystems. Cities represent complete alterations of geological, hydrological, ecological, environmental parameters. And they're growing. They're growing around the world. And they're growing in large part with human population size growth, as well as shifts in economic pressures that drive people into cities for jobs, for security, what have you. And so it's really important then to understand this ecosystem and to understand the impacts that it has on the world, as well as the impacts that it has on people's lives that live within cities. And cities, in some ways, are the ultimate outcome of the Anthropocene, the era that we live in right now. And so the Anthropocene is the geological age we are in, which is informed and influenced by human activities. And cities, in some ways, are what the future of the Anthropocene could look like at a global scale. And we want to think about the impact of the Anthropocene. One of the examples I give is, let's say sometime millions of years in the future, an extraterrestrial paleontologist comes to Earth and studies the geological record. They'll see in the geological record more doorknobs than trilobites, right? That is the permanent, irreversible types of impacts that we've had on Earth's systems that are permanent. They'll be part of the permanent record of the geological record. But more proximately, cities represent a number of changes to local environments. There's changes in the chemical composition of air and water, nutrient inputs, disturbances, influences like changes in light and sound that all have consequences for organisms and the well-being of the environment. And we know that cities influence biodiversity, certainly within city scales. We know that some taxa, like birds, are greatly affected by urbanization. So we see massive declines in species richness of birds as we go across urbanization gradients. So species richness is in green, and the number of individuals is in the orange color. And so you might say, why do we see increases in individuals in birds? Pigeons or rock doves would be the reason. So total number of birds might stay stable or increase, but the diversity of birds greatly declines. Some groups of arthropods are very sensitive to urbanization, like beetles, for example. Other groups, like spiders, appear to be relatively insensitive. Plants show very interesting patterns where we know that the total number of individuals of plants decrease with urbanization, and that's because we have impervious surface, open areas, buildings that occupy land that was once covered by plants. So the total amount of area that can be occupied by plants decreases with urbanization. But the changes in diversity are all over the place with plants, and in large part depend on our practices of gardening, introducing species, and taking care of individual plants. And so we tend to see a high diversity of non-native species, plant species in urban areas. And so these biodiversity responses to urbanization affect different species in different ways. And life history strategies and ecological strategies are quite important. But one aspect that seems to stand out is the importance of species origin as their species are impacted by urbanization. And so non-Indigenous species, which you'll see referred to as NIS in this talk, just for short form, provide insights into the impacts of urbanization and help us understand the ways in which cities select for certain types of species and select against other types of species. And so there is some evidence out there that urbanization seems to be beneficial for non-Indigenous species. As areas become more urbanized, we tend to see on average larger population sizes of non-native species compared to natives. We tend to see greater diversity at the community level of non-native species as we increase in urbanization. So there's not a ton of robust studies that look at urbanization gradients, that quantify urbanization gradients. There's a lot of studies that might compare, say, a park and a woodlot. But there's not a lot that actually quantify the effect of urbanization. So, for example, increases in impervious surface or increases in human density. But the evidence that we do have does suggest that greater urbanization promotes invasion. And we know that from a large scale look, we know that cities are hotspots of non-Indigenous species. So, for example, in the flora of Toronto, we see almost 2,000 plant species on record. And about 40% of those are non-Indigenous species. It's generally believed about a quarter of the flora of Ontario is non-Indigenous. So Toronto itself is a hotspot of non-Indigenous species. And we might ask, is this atypical? No, we see this over and over again as we look in cities, that in this study here and others across Europe, we typically see that that cities, the flora of cities tend to contain more than about 30 to 40% of their species being from elsewhere. And so in this example from central Russia, we see that cities in their pretty extreme climate harbor about 30% of their flora being non-Indigenous species. And it's much, much higher than the proportion that exists in the larger regions surrounding these cities. So again, every time we look at a city, we see that cities tend to be hotspots for or concentrations of non-Indigenous species. So urbanization influences non-Indigenous species. And so we might ask, then why are they benefiting? Why do we see these hotspots in cities? And really there's four main reasons. One is that cities are invasion hubs, right? This is where people and goods move typically from one place to another, is through cities. And so any stowaways that we have are likely to have their first beachhead in a city. Similarly, purposeful introductions are typically moving into cities. So whether it's for gardening or pet trade, those places of arrival are typically in cities, and people that are buying them and taking care of them or planting them tend to be in cities. So cities are important in the network of invasion. Cities are also focal points of disturbance, right? Human activity is concentrated in cities, And so these disturbances provide opportunity and opening for non-native species. Just as an example, looking at the boreal region in Canada, we see that with increasing human disturbance on the bottom axis here, we see that that native species tend to show a little bit of an increase than a decline, but non-indigenous species show a steady increase with disturbance. And so if you look at the ratio between native and exotic species across a disturbance gradient, you see there's this decline in this ratio as non-native species become a larger proportion of the overall assemblage. Cities are also places where there are reductions in competition. And so in just these three examples here, a garden, a crop, street trees, humans purposely reduce competition. They space individuals apart. They separate out different species, so we're not having interspecific competition. They support and promote individuals as opposed to allowing populations to collide and interact. And so by reducing this competition, we allow species establish initially small populations with little threat of being excluded by competition, right? For species that might struggle to invade an intact ecosystem, well, we give them plenty of space and opportunity in cities that allow them to overcome any sort of bottlenecks or limitations of small population sizes so that they become established. And finally, cities are places where environmental conditions are altered, right? And so, for example, we all know that that there are temperature increases with increasing impervious surface in cities, as well as changes in soil moisture and nutrient availability and pollutants. A number of different environmental variables change with urbanization. And in these contexts, we tend to be selecting for species that possess certain kinds of traits that allow them to persist in these environments. And these might be selecting against many of the native species that have evolved in historical climates that exist in the region, but are not well adapted to the new environmental conditions in cities. And so we know that these non-native species benefit from urbanization, but we need to be careful to not say that cities are homogeneous in their opportunities for cities. And in fact, we know that cities are very heterogeneous places. There's very different types of habitats, ecosystems, communities that exist within cities. So in the picture here, we see a manicured, highly managed park versus a semi-natural woodlot, both within a city, and both these two different habitats are going to harbor different types of species and have different opportunities for non-indigenous species. And so the openness of different types of green spaces in a city to invasion or to harboring non-native species really depends on a number of factors, things like management regimes, disturbance, access by people, environmental stressors, local biodiversity, and so on. But broadly, we can group these influences into three classes: propagular pressure, which is the number of individuals that are able to invade a green space; abiotic conditions, right? So changes to local environmental conditions. Is it stressful? Is it benign? And finally, biotic conditions. So is there a lot of competition? Is a lot of local biodiversity? And so we can think of all the possible influences of these green spaces. So things like competition, things like biomass production, things like the shape and size of the green space or access of the public, there's all these different types of influences. And so when we view green spaces as being some combination of propagular pressure, abiotic influences, and biotic factors, what we end up with is the realization that we can put all green spaces onto one spectrum. All we need to do is fine-tune these different influences, and we can make predictions about the role of these different green spaces on invasion. So for example, we might have green spaces where there's high public access, or a lot of trails or roads. And we might then predict that there's going to be higher propensity for those green spaces to harbor non-native species. Whereas other green spaces might have high biodiversity, high plant biomass, and those might be more resistant to invasion. And so we can look at green spaces not as idiosyncratic or context-dependent places that may or may not support non-Indigenous species, but we can look at them through the lens of these different influences, and we can make pretty informed decisions about which type of green spaces we ought to really be careful with and which ones we should manage. And so management in an urban context is actually quite complicated. So not only do we have these different kinds of green spaces that have these different influences, but cities sit within very complex social, economic, and political contexts. And so in a natural area far removed from a city, the presence of a non-Indigenous species, a population of a non-Indigenous species, usually can have a very straightforward set of decision triggers about whether or not to manage that specific non-Indigenous species or to manage the habitat. In cities, it becomes much more complicated because it is in part informed by human perception about human desire, about the impacts of those non-native species and other influences. And so sometimes we may have to decide to tolerate certain non-Indigenous species because of human perception, or we might have to raise awareness before we can take any action. And so in urban contexts, the need to have very clear thresholds, prioritization schemes that help identify which species and where should be managed is really necessary. And one of the things that we did, and I don't want you to go through this table, I'm just using it as an example, is we went through dozens and dozens of cases of non-Indigenous species or invasive species management in cities. And we asked the basic question of whether or not these management actions were articulating prioritization schemes, so how they were deciding which species or where to manage, or if they had clear, transparent thresholds for management. So, are there quantitative measures, say on the population size or the range size or the degree of impact that would trigger management? And to our surprise, only about half of management projects identified are identified priorities, and only 8% had clear threshold for triggering management actions. And so it tends to be a little bit opaque as to when and where management happens in cities. But if we're dealing with these complex social economic contexts, it's really important to be clear and precise about where those management actions are coming from and why they're being taken, especially for species that may have some degree of sympathy within cities. So that's kind of a broad overview of what's happening in cities with invasion. Now I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive. And understanding these broad statistical patterns can be really important for prevention, for understanding where invaders are coming from, how they're moving through a system, the types of management options. But moving from non-Indigenous species per se to those that become invasive, requires more detailed information. We need to understand why species are successful and why they may have disproportionate impact. And so to understand that, we really need to understand what it takes for a species to become a successful invader. So we have this intact native community, and this gold species comes in, it's an invasive species, and becomes quite abundant in this community, might have some impacts. Well, why is it successful? Well, really, there's just a finite number of possibilities that can explain its success at a very high level. These don't require any specific mechanism. They really require just a high-level understanding of the ways in which species interact. And so the one way is that this invasive species occupies unique niche space. That is, it's accessing some resources that are not being fully utilized by the native species that are there. And we often see this as the case with disturbances or eutrophication or other human influences that might expand niche space or provide new niche openings. In this case, we expect a species to be successful. It's established, it'll grow in population size, but it may not have direct negative impacts on the native species. It may not be causing competitive exclusion, reductions in population size. The other commonly cited mechanism is that the non-native species, the invasive species, comes in and does overlap with the native species, right? Is accessing the same resources, but it has higher fitness. It's able to reproduce at a higher rate, has higher reproductive success, and so likely impacts those native species, reducing the population size and maybe extirpating them. And this happens quite often. One of the most commonly cited reasons why this would happen is that species that are introduced are often escaping their natural enemies that have co-evolved with them in their native habitats. So pathogens, herbivores, predators, etc., are not moving with those species. And so because they're not realizing the costs of those enemies, they're able to put more resources into reproduction. And so in the first case, we would say that we should see these non-native species stably coexisting with the native species. Just think of Queen Anne's lace, for example. It might be occupying some of the gravelly roadside verge that not a lot of native species like, but it's in the community, it's not going to be excluding species. And then we see species where there's some competitive exclusion. There's a third possibility now, and that is that we see a species altering niche space. So in this case, the invader comes in and through changes to the environment, restricts the niche axis, restricts the spaces where non-native species can persist. So this could happen through chemical changes or biological changes to soil, for example. It could change the light environment. And so we might see large-scale changes to the ecosystem that are not necessarily explained by competition, but are explained by species effect on the system. And so this would be an ecosystem modifier. So with that in mind, we're going to take a close look at Vincitatum rossicum, dog strangling vine, or referred to DSV. It's a common invader, really quite prolific here in Toronto. It's one of the main study organisms for people in my lab. We've been working on this for about 10 years now, and we just have a suite of papers that have just been coming out in the last couple of years that are really trying to paint the picture to understand DSV's success and impact. So today, dog strangling vine exists across southern Ontario, but really concentrated around Toronto and Ottawa. In Toronto, we know that Toronto was its first point of introduction in the mid to late 1800s. It was introduced for a number of reasons, probably for stabilization, also just being a unique, prolific, growing, nice green plant species. And it quickly spread in the past few decades across the city. This pattern here might be partially influenced or biased by sampling for this species, but we do know that its population has exploded in the past few decades. We do a lot of our work in Canada's newest national park, the Rouge Urban National Park, that sits on the eastern edge of Toronto and the western edge of Pickering, also sits on the edge of the city of Markham. And in the park, we've established hundreds of plots across an invasion gradient of DSV. And in those plots, we've been monitoring them every year for 10 years. And we look at a number of different elements of the diversity and functioning of the communities that DSV is in. Just to give you a sense of what some of the sites look like, in uninvaded sites or sites with very low DSV cover, we tend to get about 15 plant species per square meter. In the most invaded sites, we have like 3 to 5 native species or resident species in those communities. So we have a number of sites across the Rouge that expand a gradient of DSV abundance. And so we're studying the dynamics across this gradient. We're also watching what happens as DSV increases in its abundance in some of these lower abundance sites as well. And so part of the story that I set up at the beginning of this section was about niche overlap, was about how different DSV is relative to the resident or native species. So does it occupy unique niche space? Does it overlap? Does it compete? Does it modify the ecosystem? Well, that concept of the niche is a very difficult thing to measure, especially in observational studies where you can't necessarily grow all these species in very controlled conditions to understand what resources they use, etc. So what we tend to do is we find indirect ways to estimate species niche differences. So for example, here's a group of trees. Let's say we're interested in two elements of their niche. So one is where they optimally grow in terms of soil moisture and light availability. We would love to be able to quantify all these, but we know that their traits, so for example, their leaf thickness, the amount of investment they put into their leaves, wood density, etc., can help us understand where they lie across these different niche axes. And so we know that two species that occupy similar niche space are going to have very similar traits. So similar types of leaves, similar types of wood density, etc. So I'll be referring to these as functional traits, or I might talk about community level measures of functional diversity. So you just know that we're really talking about the traits that are giving us a sense of the similarities and differences in niche space among these species. You also see a word pop up that we refer to as phylogenetic diversity, which we also look at how genetically similar species are. So again, the same logic, species that are genetically very similar. So these two conifers here are most likely to occupy similar niche space than, say, a species that's very distantly related or genetically dissimilar. So those are just measures that are meant to capture some of these niche similarities and differences. I don't make a big deal about them, but they're there for us to help us understand and measure. So this is a little complicated, but this is kind of what way we see DSV having an impact in these systems. So as DSV abundance increases, we know it's going to have a set of impacts on community or ecosystem diversity. And so there's different ways we measure diversity, right? We can measure just the number of species. We can measure diversity indices that include, evenness in their abundance, but we can also measure those niche-based measures based on the traits of species or based on their genetic similarities. So we're just going to look at DSV's impact on biodiversity to start off. So we can start off with a pretty clear hypothesis that as DSV abundance increases, we see a decrease in biodiversity. And we'll show that in red. At the same time, we might suspect there could be elements of diversity that increase with DSV, and we'll show that in dark purple. So a bunch of different measures. We're not going to focus in on too much on them, but the point I want to make is that across a whole bunch of different measures of biodiversity, we see these negative relationships. So in red, I'm showing that there's a negative relationship between DSV and that measure of biodiversity. And in fact, we see that, for example, the proportion of native species is really negatively impacted by increasing DSV abundance. The one that's positive is the percent of non-native species. So what we see is native species are very sensitive to increasing DSV population size, but exotic species tend to be relatively insensitive. So they tend to hang on longer. Some might even benefit from the presence of DSV. So the point is we see these massive declines. So I start off by saying there's really three possibilities, right? One was that DSV inhabits a unique niche, or it's within niche space and is a superior competitor, or it kind of changes the system. I'm not going to go into the specifics of how we do this with traits. It's a little bit statistically complicated, but I'm just going to say at this point, what it looks like, most of the traits tell us this, is that DSV seems to be analogous to some sort of ecosystem modifier or niche engineer. It seems to change the trait composition, the niche composition of these communities in ways that is not predicted by direct competition. So DSV is is in most of our recent research, I'll show you a little bit, is about changing soil chemistry and about changing light environments, decomposition rates, nutrient cycling, etc. So it's having these ecosystem level impacts that alter the kinds of species. We've also done this in different habitat types, meadow and understory. And we're interested in this comparison because understory already has a restricted niche axis because of limited light availability. And in the understory, we see a little bit more of a signature of direct competition being important. Whereas in the meadow, we see that signature of large scale habitat modification. And we do a number of analyses. And again, I'm not going to get into details because it's statistically quite complicated. It relies on a number of hierarchical models. But what we're able to do is disentangle the effects of those that are in red that are analogous to direct interaction, so competition most likely, and those that I've colored in cool colors, so the green colors, which are indirect modifications that seem to be affected by changes in, for example, nitrogen availability in soil or pH or changes in decomposition. And the take-home message from this is that for a lot of these types of measures, let's just look at species richness, a little less than half of the change in species richness seems to be predicted by direct competition, and a lot of that is driven by the forest understory. And about half of the impact of DSV seems to be driven by changes to the ecosystem, changes to, for example, pH of the soil. And those are the ecosystem modification. So it seems like DSV is having impacts at a number of different levels, depending on who it's with and where it's invading. And so the question is, so what? So we know DSV comes in, and as it spreads, increases in abundance, we're losing native species. Does this have consequences at a larger scale, at ecosystem scale? And so we know that different forms of diversity seem to be changing at different rates, right? We might see losses of species, we might see changes in traits, but what does that mean for the functioning of that ecosystem? There's a whole bunch of research out there that shows that as we see declines in diversity, whether that diversity is number of species, so we see decline going from, for example, 32 to 1 species, or we see decline in the number of functional groups or functional diversity based on traits, we see declines there. We typically see declines in ecosystem function. So, for example, productivity or the amount of carbon that's being sequestered into plant biomass, right? As we decrease the number of species, we see declines in the ability of the ecosystem to sequester carbon dioxide. But it's not clear how invasion should affect these ecosystem functions. And the reason is that an invader is an invader because it has high fitness. It achieves really high population size. So ignoring the native community, just having the species that increases in its abundance should increase ecosystem function. But since it is having that impact on native species, we should also expect a decline in ecosystem function through those extirpations. So what actually happens? So we know DSV is coming in and it's causing changes to the functional structure of communities. It's causing declines in diversity. And so the question is, what happens here? Well, again, the same type of figure. Red is declines, purple is increases. And what we see is a bunch of declines again, right? So we see that as DSV increases in abundance and as the native community becomes more depauperate, we see declines in, say, and for things like pollinator support, in biomass production, in the amount of litter. The only thing that we see an increase in is nitrogen, and that's likely because we're seeing the effects of changes in nitrogen cycling caused by DSV. So this is an ongoing area of research, and so far we know that DSV is reducing community diversity in very non-random ways. And it appears that DSV occupies relatively unique niche space and still alters the community by changing the ecosystem. I haven't shown you this, but DSV is homogenizing communities. So communities that might start out relatively different from one another, with different plant species, are becoming more and more similar with DSV. It's selecting for similar kinds of species to be successful. And we know that these diversity declines result in consequences to ecosystem function. And so I'm just going to end off with a couple of slides just to tell you about one of the ways in which we're moving forward. So this example of DSV is really about one invader in one place. We know it's important, we know it has big impacts, but we do have relatively poor understanding of how urban areas influence the success of exotic species and how it influences invasion. What is the role of urbanization, trade, history, economics, climate on the propensity for cities to be invaded? And so one of the projects that I've been leading is one that's called the Global Urban Biological Invasions Consortium, or GUBIC. So it's just a fancy title for a group of people that have come together to study urban invasions. And it was designed as a network of researchers to answer key questions about cities and invasion, to develop collaboration, to provide policy guidance. This idea was conceived in 2016 at a Center for Invasion Biology workshop in Stellenbosch, South Africa. And it now includes more than 120 researchers in more than 30 countries around the world. And what we've been doing is we've basically had three phases. One is creating this consortium, is to consolidate data on urban ecosystems, and to promote designed replicate studies around the world in cities. And so we formed this consortium. Pre-COVID, we actually had some great in-person meetings here in Toronto from researchers from around the world. Since COVID, they've been virtual meetings, which doesn't give rise to as nice of photographs. But we've had these opportunities to get people together to really think and discuss problems around urban invasions. And we're really investigating several research objectives to assess invasion patterns within cities. So what is the role of within city heterogeneity and urban to rural gradients on species, non-native species, population sizes and diversity? Again, how to assess the role of political history, economics, trade, environmental differences in invasion. We're trying to get information to quantify ecosystem services or disservices provided by non-native species, especially those that are invasive. How do they affect the services provided to people and the environmental qualities of cities? And we're trying to assess urban policy and management, especially around decision triggers in different socioeconomic conditions. So does on-the-ground invasion here in Toronto trigger a same response from municipal agencies as, say, one in Johannesburg, South Africa? And so the first sets of papers are finally coming out. We've in the data set that we've compiled data on about, we have about 500 data sets from around the world now from City Biota, and that paper will be coming out soon. But we welcome ideas, collaborations, people that might be interested in either the output elements of this work or being involved in some of this work. It's ongoing number of different collaborations, and we're really trying to make sure that we maximize the impact of this work for not only understanding the role of cities in invasions, but also trying to understand how to manage them and how to move forward. And so with that, I'm up to the end of my time. And so I owe a lot of thanks to various people in my lab who have contributed to a lot of this work over time. And with that, I guess I have some time for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Mark. That was great. And thanks for sharing your collaborative group there. We had some speakers on this morning at the forum that are doing some municipal work, so I'm sure there would be some interest in that. So we did have a couple of questions come in. When considering environmental changes for the forest understory, did you include the changes to the soil that invasive earthworms cause? Common and glossy buckthorns, allopathic impacts in the soil. Worms can cause huge changes in the soil texture, nutrient cycles, leaf litter depth, and reduced stratification. That's
a great question. And we are at that point right now. So we've started to, well, so what I should say with our work in DSV in general, we've moved below ground in a lot of different ways, because that's where a lot of the impact is being realized. We do suspect that there's interactions with earthworms. So the earthworms you see coming into your lawn, I'm sure everyone knows, are non-native. But we also, anecdotally, we also see interactions between DSV and invasive fire ants. DSV is ant pollinated, but we're now doing work on assessing the interaction between DSV and earthworms. So we've just established some collaborations to do that. So that's literally on the next stage of our work.
Very cool. That sounds really exciting. Did your research also include temporal niches?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about this. We also do work on garlic mustard. And so most people know garlic mustard is an early spring species. It bolts early in the year, overwinters very well as basal rosettes. You dig up the snow now, you'll see green basal rosettes of garlic mustard. And we do have some projects that look at the temporal partitioning of basically the partitioning of time as a niche between garlic mustard and dog strangling vine. And when they're together, they provide a really lethal 1-2 punch through the year of when they're biologically active. And so we do work on that. We also do work on the temporal aspect is on flowering of the community and support for pollinators. So as we're losing native species non-randomly, we're losing certain segments of temporal floral niches. And so there are certain times of year now where floral resources have been greatly reduced, and that impacts some pollinators more than others. So DSV might not impact early spring flowering species as much as later flowering species, or especially midsummer flowering species. And so we're really trying to scale up to understand which types of pollinators that most impacts when we see those pollinator declines.
Great, thank you. How would you characterize the dozen species included in Toronto's newly renamed turfgrass and prohibited species bylaw?
I sat on that committee, and the one thing I'll say is that I advocated for I guess a nimble and responsive list of species, but I can understand that they wanted to have something in the bylaw that was written in stone. In my opinion, I think it might just make changing it a little bit more cumbersome, but I understand. Yeah, I guess what I will say is, it was a great process, and I'm glad they did that. But what I will say is that I think we do need mechanisms in place that allow us to respond to emerging threats as opposed to established ones, right? Because sure, we don't want somebody planting dog strangling vine, but would it change its invasion now? No, it's everywhere. But what we don't want is somebody to be planting the next invader. And so there needs to be a way to incorporate emerging threats and new knowledge into these types of restrictions.
Absolutely, that's a great point, Mark, that proactive management, right?
Yeah.
And one last question, and I think we'll be right on time. If municipalities are interested in collaborating with you and some of the GUBIC, is that right, GUBIC?
Yep.
Research, how do we connect with you in the group?
Oh, that's great. You can just email me directly. You can just Google my name. I'm easy to find on Google. I have a unique name. Yeah, that's probably the best way. Just Google me and send me an email, and I can add you to our listservs and give you information about what we're up to and where collaborations lie.
Okay, great. We have 1 more minute, so when we had one more question come in, so I'm going to squeeze it in. Does dog strangling vine have a root network as dense as its top growth? If so, does it impact ground nesting pollinators?
So 2 parts to that question. One is the below ground network is insane. I mean, a really established, and I'm one of those. I believe that DSV, unlike other plants, tends to have some positive density effects. So the denser it gets, the better it is. Anyway, and part of that is it has these huge root balls, these massive root networks below ground that obviously change the structure of the soils, change the opportunity for other species, et cetera. And does it affect ground nesting? I guess you mean bees primarily, so solitary bees and wasps that nest in the ground. I would say its canopy certainly does, because ground nesting species of insect tend to like open ground that sunlight is directly hits, so it stays warm. So in that sense, it does. As far as and also the chemicals, right? So DSV is highly allelopathic, so it exudes a number of alkaloids that are toxic. That's why when you look at DSV population, not a single leaf is touched by any herbivore. And so that would probably make a fairly inhospitable environment for some insects, and then the roots themselves. So it probably has multifaceted effect on ground nesters.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mark. So with that, we'll close off your presentation. Thanks for being here and for sharing your great expertise. So we really appreciate your time.
Thanks everyone for listening.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll move on to our next keynote speaker of the afternoon. Oh, I didn't mean to shut my video off, sorry. Ken Donnelly. Ken is the president of Beyond Attitude Consulting, and he's going to be presenting this afternoon on why many people don't take action to prevent the spread and what you can do about it. For 30 years, Ken has worked with government and non-governmental organizations to foster positive individual behaviors, primarily in the areas of environment, health, transportation, and occupational health and safety. For the past 10 years, his primary focus has been the human dimensions of invasive species. Since the year 2000, Ken has trained over 10,000 people in behavior change principles in workshops across Canada, the US, the UK, and the Caribbean. Ken also publishes a free weekly electronic bulletin on behavior change, which has subscribers from around the world. So welcome, Ken, and I will pass it over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, MacKenzie. Can you just verify my audio is okay, as well as the slide?
Yeah, everything's great.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that nice introduction, and thank you everyone for listening. Mark, that was a great presentation. I learned a lot. We're dealing with dog strangling vine in Nova Scotia right now, so it's great to get all of that information. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that we're in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory and ancestral homeland of the Mi'kmaq Nation. Our relationship is based on a series of peace and friendship treaties between the Mi'kma'ki Nation and the Crown, dating back to 1725. We are all treaty people. So today I'm going to talk about several things. I want to talk about how, for those people who are doing community or communications, education, outreach, why sometimes you might be frustrated that people aren't doing what you want them to do. I'm going to talk about why changing behavior is like moving a piano, why commitment is crucial and how to get it, how to get a lot of free help in convincing people to take on the actions that you want them to take on, and quickly how to grab attention. But first, I'm going to take you back to the 1980s. With all that big hair. In the 1980s, the biggest environmental issue that was being dealt with across populations across Canada, and particularly in Ontario, was the startup of recycling programs. And I was quite involved in that. I used to work for Durham Region for a while, and I worked in the solid waste area. And we would put out brochures like this, and they might just be mail dropped or they might be delivered door to door. But this was sort of the extent of communications and education at the time, very rudimentary and not a lot of information. It essentially would say, we've started a curbside collection program or something like that. And the thought at the time was that recycling was a good thing. So all you had to do was start a recycling program. And because it was a good thing, everybody would recycle. So we didn't have a lot of emphasis on taking action and that sort of thing. We also felt that all you had to do was tell somebody that the benefits of recycling and they would do it. So you would see ads in newspapers or magazines or posters that would be like this, and where there's a light bulb and a bottle, and it says recycling just one plastic bottle saves enough energy to power a 60-watt light bulb for 6 hours. You can see there's no call to action there. There's nothing about how to recycle, nothing about maybe don't buy that plastic bottle in the first place. Just this fact that you can power a 60-watt light bulb for 6 hours if you recover the energy from recycling a plastic pop bottle. And again, the assumption was that everybody would just do it once they had this knowledge, because we're all rational people, logical people. But unfortunately, people aren't that logical, and it doesn't come that easily. And we still ended up with a lot of garbage going to landfills, particularly in Southern Ontario, so much so that Toronto's garbage ended up going to Michigan for a very long time, because there was no more place to stick it in the landfills in the Toronto area, in the GTA. So the landfills were filling up with garbage and recyclables still. And it turned out that we came to the realization that just telling people that something was a good thing to do didn't mean that they were going to do it. And so we had to accept that that approach was just not working. In the early 90s, fortunately, Doug MacKenzie Moore, a professor of behavioral psychology at St. Thomas University in New Brunswick, wrote a book that has become quite famous now, and so has Doug, the Fostering Sustainable Behavior, and he coined the term community-based social marketing. And what Doug taught us was that just knowledge enough, being educated enough was not enough to change people's behavior. So if people had the right attitude that you wanted them to have, and they had all the awareness of the subject that you wanted them to have, it did not mean that they were going to change their behavior. And that was a very important thing to learn about. And just to underscore that, I like to use, I have a bunch of different examples I like to use. This is one of my favorites. Doctors and nurses and other medical professionals washing hands. So I say doctors for short, but it can include nurses. And you would think that given that doctors and nurses go to school for a very long time, and they learn all about the importance of washing hands to prevent the spread of infectious disease, that, you know, it's fair to say that 100% of doctors have the attitude that it's important to wash their hands. And they're aware of all the reasons why they can interrupt the spread of infectious disease from one patient to another. So I think it's fair to say that they all understand that. Otherwise, they wouldn't be practicing, because they wouldn't have passed their tests. But in a study in the Victoria region at several different medical facilities, they observed hand washing behavior and found that only 12% of the time were medical professionals meeting the protocols of hand washing behavior. And this is not just an issue on Vancouver Island in Victoria. There was a big study done in 2015 in the US with 34 hospitals. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of reading this data to you, but they looked at 4,000 different caregivers in these hospitals, nurses and doctors, and they saw 14 million washing hands opportunities when somebody should have been washing their hands because they were going from one patient to another or whatever. But they found that only half of the time that these medical professionals were compliant with the protocols for washing their hands. And it became worse in the afternoon when compliance came down 38% from the morning compliance, which would say to you that if you were going to get hit by a bus tomorrow, you'd be a lot better off if you got hit by the morning commute bus, because then when you went to the emergency room, you'd have a much better chance that the doctor and nurses taking care of you had washed their hands before they came to see you, as opposed to what might happen if you got hit by a bus late in the afternoon. So these findings extrapolates to 600,000 unnecessary infections 35,000 unnecessary deaths, and $12.5 billion in added costs in the US annually. This is a worldwide problem. I speak in a lot of different places, and if I'm using this example, I just Google doctors washing hands, and I can pick up a story any place in the world on the problems with the lack of hand washing at medical facilities. There's been a lot of work done in the last 15 years or so, which has improved the rates, which are very good. But there's a newspaper article just in September of 2020 in Manitoba that said only 2 out of 3 doctors were washing their hands. So the point is that, and this is the most important point that you should take away from this presentation, is just because somebody has the correct attitude and awareness that you want them to have and that you may be educating them on, it doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily take that action. There's a huge gap between people's attitude and their awareness and their action. And you can probably think of some of these things in your own life. Many of us, just a month ago, in January 1st, made a whole bunch of, made New Year's resolutions. And here it is, only the beginning of February, and we're off them already. We had the intention because we had the attitude and the awareness, but we didn't follow up with the action. It's very, very common. In fact, it's so common that psychologists have a name for the phenomenon. They call it the intention-action gap, when somebody has the intention to do something, but they don't actually do it. And you can't, so what you need to remember is that it's not enough to just convince people that something's a good idea and then sit back and expect behavior will follow, because it's not going to happen. For the most part. So now I'm not saying don't do what you're doing with education to try and get the right attitude and awareness out there. Because as, for example, if you were standing in front of a blood donor clinic and stopping people on the street and nobody knew anything about the benefits of blood donation and how safe it is, if you were to stop people and say, look, would you just come into this building with me? We're going to lie you down on a gurney, and we're going to stick a needle in your arm and take a pint of blood out of you. Not many people would opt for that. So it is important that they have to have the right attitude and awareness. Just the right attitude and awareness alone is not enough. So given that, I'm going to go through the steps to behavior change. And these are the most important steps, I feel, of a good behavior change program, and where it brings in behavioral psychology. And the first is doing your research. Second is barriers, and finding out what the barriers are that are preventing some people from taking your action, getting commitments from people, and then reminding people, and using social norms. And I'm going to talk too, and this is very important, about how those last 3 elements work together to be much stronger than their parts. So first of all, with literature, when we do these programs, these are the tools that we use. We do literature review. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we do literature reviews to take advantage of the work that has been done by others, find out what the best practices are, and that sort of thing. We almost always do surveys in the programs that we do for our clients, because you can take a relatively small sample and ask questions of people, and as long as that survey is representative and large enough, then you can extrapolate the results to the entire population with confidence. We only do focus groups if there's something that we're trying to drill down on, maybe an anomaly in the surveys or literature reviews, and we think we should get a few people together and dig deep on this issue and try and find out what's going on. Otherwise, we don't normally do focus groups. But observations are awesome, because you get social response bias in surveys where people will say, the right thing that they think that you want to hear. For instance, I've done a lot of waste management surveys where the results say that 95% of people say that they recycle, but at the same time, we go out and we do a count of how many people actually have recyclables out at the curb, and it's more like 80%. So people know what makes them, puts them in a good light, and they tend to exaggerate. But observations, either having some students perhaps at the head of a trail watching to see how many people are using the boot brush station, or watching to see how many people clean, drain, and dry their boat, or whatever it might be, those observations are more accurate. And a good tip is, where you can, you have to be careful, but where you can, if you can put a camera up and just take or record video of what it is you're looking at, rather than having somebody sit there for 8 hours. They can go retrieve the SD card, sit down at their computer, and scrub through the video and look at the observations in much less time, more efficiently. But the main thing about doing the research that I take home is, do your research. Do not make assumptions. All of us have our own expertise in the area of invasive species, some with very strong expertise and experience, but what we don't have expertise in is what somebody else is thinking. And I can tell you that after 30 years of doing surveys, several a year, I always learn something from every survey I do, something I didn't know before, or an assumption that I might have made that would have been wrong. So you have to do your research. A primary thing, a primary goal of doing that research, and surveys are really good for it, is to identify what barriers are preventing people from taking your action. I like to look at barriers as being like friction, a force pushing against a person adopting a behavior. And Daniel Kahneman, who is the first of the only 2 behavioral economists who have won a Nobel Prize, says that removing barriers, or making the actions that you want people to take more convenient, is the most important thing about behavior change. So you have to identify those barriers, and you have to remove them. So it's kind of like pushing a piano up a ramp to get it into the front door of a house. It's very heavy. There's a lot of work involved in trying to get that up. If there are barriers, if there are barriers that are preventing people from taking the action. If you can remove those barriers, then you can reduce a lot of that force and make it easier for them to adopt your barriers. If you can remove those barriers completely and actually make this new action that you want people to take easier than what they're doing now, then you'll have made a huge advance in getting them to adopt this new behavior. It may be that you still have to remind them and do other work, which I'm going to talk about soon, in order to get them to start doing it. But at least you've made it a heck of a lot easier for them to take on those actions, and therefore a lot easier for you to have success in getting them to change their behaviors. So I want to show you some barriers that arose from a survey I did for the Canadian Council on Invasive Species in 2018. And this survey wasn't just on clean, drain, dry, it was on a wide range of outdoor behaviors. But in one of the questions we said, and this is typical what we do in our surveys, looking at the human dimensions of behavior change, or of invasive species, we would say, do you clean, drain, and dry? And for those people who said no, we'd say, well, why not? And in an open text box in this survey, people told us why what might prevent them from clean, draining, and drying their boats. And as I'm sure you're familiar with word clouds, but the larger the print is on these words, then the more frequently these words came up. And you can see lack is prominent there, and so is knowledge. And lack of knowledge came up a lot as a barrier for people taking action with respect to clean, drain, dry. Forgetting, you can see that up above the G in knowledge, in blue there, that was very, very common. People would just say, I forget to do it. And I can tell you that I've worked on a lot of different programs and on different issues, and forgetting is very, very common, a common behavior for people to adopting the actions that you want. Laziness came up. Time. Now, those of you who are boaters know that there can be some anxiety at a boat launch, especially if it's busy. If you're not very good at backing your trailer down into the hill to the water, you've got people glaring at you and looking at their watches. How long is this jerk going to take? So there's the time that it takes is there can be time pressures, and that came up. Unfortunately, nothing came up fairly often too for a lot of people. You'll see just above the G again with knowledge, equipment, lack of equipment. That's a barrier. That's a systemic barrier where people don't have the equipment that they need, perhaps to clean, drain, and dry. That's more challenging to resolve than just reminding them and that sort of thing. So you have to look at some of these things as systemic or just attitudinal, perhaps, or internal changes that they can make. So how do you remove some of these barriers? Well, of course, putting the equipment in is an important one. But on some of these things, like forgetting and not having the knowledge that they need, you can resolve those more readily. When we do, in our projects, when we do interventions, I often am involved in training the people, and I train them. I often write scripts for them. We do the research, we find out what the barriers are, and I write scripts for them, or I train them on how to essentially take apart an argument that somebody might be putting forward about why they aren't doing things. And I developed this animation just about a month ago for the Caledonian University in Glasgow, which I've had an association with for quite a while. And one of my friends, a professor there, wanted me to present to his waste management class. So I know from a lot of research that in waste management, 3 common barriers are: people say they don't know what to do. I'm not recycling because I don't know what to do. They say that they think it's too much work, and they think that there's they'll say, well, I don't even know when I'm supposed to put the right bins out. So in this animation, you're going to hear Anne, who's working for the local authority, talk to Bob, whose house this is. And she's going to, in just 1 minute, remove 3 barriers that Bob throws up in defending why he doesn't recycle. She's going to take those 3 barriers away from him. And then she's going to say, now that you have all of the information, are you going to recycle? And she's asking for a commitment from him to recycle. And commitment will be my next topic. So let's just have a listen to this. Watch and listen, I guess.
Hi, my name is Anne. I noticed that you don't have any recycling material out for collection. Is there anything I can do to help?
Hi Anne, I am Bob. I am not sure what is recyclable and what isn't, so I don't know what to do.
Well, I can help you with that. I have a brochure here explaining what is recyclable, what goes in the compost, and what is rubbish. Here you go. Is there anything else preventing you from recycling?
That seems like a lot of work. I don't know if I want to do all that sorting.
It isn't sorting. It's just a matter of putting things in the right bin when you don't want them anymore. It's not like you have to sort through a whole bunch of material.
Well, I suppose that's true. When you put it that way, it doesn't seem very difficult.
No, it isn't difficult. Is there anything else that I can do to help you start recycling?
I don't know which days I'm supposed to put out which bins. Do you have a schedule or something like that?
Sure, there is a collection schedule on the brochure I gave you. I suggest you do what I do and put a reminder on your mobile phone. Anything else you need?
No, thank you.
My pleasure. Now that you have everything, will you recycle?
Yes, you can count on it.
So you can see there that she sort of deftly in a conversation took away his 3 primary barriers and then said to him, is there anything else? And he said no. And that's the great time to say, okay, well, will you recycle? Because if you have no other reason why not to, then you're probably going to say yes. And let's talk about that kind of commitment. Now, this is a photo I use a lot because it says so much. I just love this photo. This is from a project that was done 10 years ago or so at Lake Simcoe with the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. You can see the fellow with his shoulder towards you was working that day, and there was a portable pressure washing system that was being used to teach people like these 3 gentlemen that are there on how to clean, drain, and dry their boats and why. And so now they have finished, and the OFAH person has said, okay, so now you know how to clean, drain, and dry your boats to stop the spread of invasive species. Can I expect that you'll do that in the future? And this fellow in the Rapala hat who owned the boat says yes. When he does, he's made a verbal commitment. And it's one thing just to teach people, and this is my point, right? You can't just stop at education. You can teach people that they should clean, drain, and dry their boat, and you can teach them how to do it, and you can teach them why to do it. But that doesn't mean they're going to do it. And this is where the behavioral psychology comes into play. This fellow he asks him, will you clean, drain, and dry your boat? This guy says yes. And now he's made a verbal commitment to that action. And that is a huge difference than not making any commitment at all. We know from the research that people who make a verbal commitment are quite likely to take the action. And the reason is, and this is where the behavioral psychology comes into play, that people in our society, if you say that you're going to do something, it's frowned upon if you don't. So there's some internal pressure to do what you, to take action consistent with what you said. But it's also a fact of behavioral psychology is that after you make a commitment like that, you change the way you see yourself. You see yourself as someone who takes care of the environment, takes care of that lake and river, wants to protect their fishing area. And so it's a difference of self-view, and they see themselves as somebody that does that. So what this fellow here has done, though, the guy with this from OFAH, as soon as that gentleman said, yes, I'll clean, drain, and dry, he handed him that pen and that clipboard, and on it is a piece of paper that looks like a petition. And he says, that's great. We want to keep a list of all of the people who have agreed to clean, drain, and dry their boat and protect our lakes and rivers from invasive species. Would you mind adding your name to the list? Well, most people will, in my experience, because they just said they would do it anyway. So they're just adding their name to the list. Then, and when they do, they've made a written commitment, even if they don't really understand that. It's a huge difference between a written commitment and a verbal commitment, as we know from the research. So it's really important to try and get that written commitment. So this guy's putting his name down, and that's a written commitment. And while he's writing his name, the fellow from OFAH is going to say, if you just tick that little box that's beside your name, you would be giving us permission to use your name in advertising or promotions. We'd like to be able to be telling other people that a lot of people like them are cleaning, draining, and drying their boats to protect the environment. And they should too. Would you help us by allowing us to use your name as sort of a reference of somebody that does that? Now, not everybody will say yes and tick the box, but a lot of people do, more than enough for a campaign. And that is helpful for campaigns, but also that person's just made a public commitment. Their name might be in something that says they're going to do it. And that is the strongest kind of commitment you can get, is a public commitment. So just one other thing about commitments is, first of all, you should try, I call that climbing the ladder of commitment. You should try and climb that ladder of commitment. When you get the verbal commitment, try to get a written, and then try to get a public commitment. As I said, commitments change the self-image. You want to seek a commitment at every opportunity. But pre-COVID, I used to say that when I'm working on these projects, anybody that gets within 10 feet of me is going to be asked for a commitment. And you have to take that kind of attitude. An important sort of management thing about commitments is we have found, I've worked on programs where we've set everything up and students have been hired and they're out in the field and they do a good job, they work hard and they provide information, but they stop short of asking for commitments. And you have to be aware, if you're hiring people, that they may be reluctant to ask for commitments. I don't know if it's fear of rejection or just being shy or whatever, but they often stop at that last step of asking for commitment. And that can really harm a program. I worked on a really big program a couple of years ago where at the end of it, they found out that they hardly had any commitments. And when they tried to find out why, the people said, I just didn't feel comfortable asking. And it was right on a piece of, they had a smartphone with that guided the conversation, and we had it right on there, ask for commitment, and they just weren't doing it. So if you're hiring people, train them how to have these interventions, put it right in the job description that their job is to get commitments. And then once they get out in the field, monitor them and check to see if they're asking for those commitments. And if they don't, correct them. Say, hey, look, we hired you to get commitments. You have to ask that question. One way to get over that trouble that they have is to show them how. I find that if I show them how easy it is to ask for commitment, then they're more likely to do it. When is the best time to ask for a commitment? It is right after you've just received a commitment from somebody. I've done a lot of research on outdoor recreation, and I always ask them to check off a list of things that they're involved in outdoor recreation. And almost everybody is involved in several aspects of recreation. Outdoors people don't just go out and ride a boat around and then go home and stay in the house all day. They don't just go fishing and not do anything else. It can be gardeners, they can be hikers, they can be camping, so they could be moving firewood. I always ask, so, if I'm at a boat launch, I'm going to say, so do you do any fishing? And the person says, yes. This would be after I got the clean, drain, dry commitment. I'd say, oh, that's great. Did you know that you should never dump your bait that you might have left over in the water? You should dispose of it on land or put it in the garbage, but don't ever put it in the water. And then try and seek a commitment for that too, because people are not, quite often in marketing, they try and break things down and really segment the audience. The fact is we're working with humans, we're not working with robots here. And we have to realize that they do other things too. And if we've just opened them up to be making a commitment to prevent the spread or introduction of invasive species, ask them for another commitment. They're ripe for the asking. So the great thing now is we've got this commitment from them, from a person, that now they want to do this. They have, as I said, they've built this internal pressure. They want to take action, the action that you want them to take. But it doesn't mean they will. And we have to support them. And we can support them with effective reminders. Effective reminders have the right information at the right time in the right place. A really good example of that I saw on a plane I was taken to Australia a couple of years ago, and because of the work I do, I watch signs very closely. In washrooms, a sign about where to put the towels when you're finished wiping your hands, it's usually placed near the garbage can or near the towel dispenser. But this is the right place to put it. They don't want people to put paper towels and other things that don't belong in the toilet. They don't want it in there. So here's a big sign, you lift the lid, now suddenly the opportunity is there to put something in the toilet that you shouldn't. And there's a sign that says, trash it, don't flush it, clogged toilets delay flights. So this is a really good example. And another really good example is this one from the Invasive Species Council of British Columbia, the sign that they have up at boat launches. It's in the right place at the right time with the right information. When somebody is going to be making a decision whether they're just going to drive away or clean, drain, and dry their boat, having the right information removes one of those big barriers that I talked about, lack of knowledge. They can take a look and what they're supposed to do. It even has that handy graphic of where to look on your boat for where there may be some aquatic hitchhikers. There's all kinds of opportunity. There's opportunities for knowing what to do there that you wouldn't have from memory, right? But also that reminder, it puts pressure on you. Like if there are other people around and you just drive by there, they may be looking at you, giving you the side eye because you haven't done the right thing. So it's a very effective reminder at the right place at the right time. I was on a call about a little over a year ago, and we were talking about clean, drain, dry, and someone on the call suggested that we get fridge magnets, clean, drain, dry fridge magnets, because everybody loves fridge magnets. And I didn't say anything on the call, but I was thinking that's great if you keep your boat in your kitchen. That's going to be at the right place at the right time. But who's going to remember or be able to use the information if they're at the boat launch and the fridge magnet is back at home on their fridge? So the final element that I want to talk about is social norms. Now, social norms or peer pressure are very effective. And once you have commitments and you've got reminders, the social norms can take advantage of those. That I had said at the outset that I would talk about how to get free help. This is how you get free help. Under that curve on the left, the innovation adoption life cycle, that green area represents everybody in a population. Could be everybody in Ontario, it could be everybody in Canada, could be everybody in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. But whatever that population is, they're all represented in that area. And from left to right, it gets harder and harder to get people to take on your actions. So you look at this left-hand side, the innovators, all of us at this conference today, we all fall in there. We're innovators. We want to stop the spread of invasive species. We know a lot about it. If something comes up, there's some new innovation that's going to help stop the spread of invasive species, we're going to do it right away. So you always have some people that are really keen on the topic, and they will get involved right away. Early adopters may not be as keen, but they may be the kind of people that, when you go to a dinner party or something, they get bored because you're talking so much about invasive species. They know you, they're friends with you, so that perhaps that you think alike. They might be environmentally inclined. They might be concerned about biodiversity and habitat, whatever it might be. Maybe they're just gardeners, but they know about invasive species, maybe not as keen, but they're likely to adopt it once they learn from you or from others about the actions that they should be taking. But then if you can get some of those innovators and early adopters and find champions in there that perhaps would put a presentation together for their neighborhood or for their garden club or whatever it is, they can start influencing the early majority. And that early majority, with peer-to-peer communications, they can be fairly readily persuaded to take these actions because they're hearing it from trusted messengers. They're hearing it from people that look like them. They're not some person in a suit that came to a big meeting. It's a comfortable situation. And those people, those early adopters and innovators can help influence the early majority. Once we get over that 50% area, that's a tipping point there. That late majority will come on more when they start seeing that everybody else is doing it. These could be people who they might not even be that environmentally inclined or aware, might not really know too much about habitat and biodiversity and that kind of thing, how important it is to protect native species. They might not know that much about it, but if they start seeing that everybody else is taking action, then they're likely to do it too, because they realize that they should be doing it. This is what happened with recycling, that eventually people who were not recycling right away would start seeing that almost all of the houses around them in their neighborhood had recycling out at the end of the driveway, at the curb on recycling day, and they didn't, and they felt the pressure and said, we should do this too. They might not have even cared about how effective it was for the environment, They just thought, ooh, we should be doing this too. And I have to point out these laggards who, some of them will come along perhaps after a long, long time. Some of them just won't. And those people can be very, can be challenging. But if you can, and you should do this strategically in developing your program, you should take a look at how you're going to get those innovators and early adopters involved early, and then how you're going to get them to help you to reach out to that early majority and late majority and assist in getting them to change their behaviors as well. To illustrate the social norms and how strong they are, when I'm giving live training or speaking at a face-to-face at a conference or something, I often use the example of the national anthem, and I'll say, how many people here have, put up your hand if you've been to a sporting event or concert or something where they play the national anthem, and virtually everybody has their hand up. And then I say, that's great. And so what do you do when the national anthem starts up? And I'll point to people, and it'll say that they'll say the national anthem. When the national anthem is about to start, then I stand up and perhaps I take my hat off or put my hand over my heart. But with the when the national anthem plays, I'm standing up. And I say, okay, that's great. And now, when you're at home, I ask, well, why are you doing that? And they'll say, well, it's important for to be patriotic, love of country. You're showing that you love Canada or love whatever country you're in. And then I'll say, okay, that's great. Now, when you're at home and you're by yourself, watching the game on the couch, and the national anthem come on, do you stand up? And put your hand up if you stand up in your living room. And there's usually one or two people who put their hand up if the audience is big enough, but nobody else does. And then there's the snickering starts. And then I'll just point to somebody else, say, okay, so why is it again that you stand up at the arena if you don't stand up in your living room? And the reply will be a sheepish, because everybody else is. And I say, yeah, that's exactly what it is. The peer pressure, if you've got 16,000 people in an arena, and everybody's standing up, that's intense peer pressure to do the right thing and stand up too. So it's an example of how strong peer pressure is. An example that everybody has some relation to. I want to show you this and video, and it needs no introduction.
The Ash experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example,
the actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1. 1. 2.
1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3. 3. 3.
3.
3.
The Ash experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again. We will conform to the group. Again, we're very social creatures. We're very much aware of what the people around us think. We want to be liked. We don't want to be seen to rock the boat, so we will go along with the group. Even if we don't believe what people are saying, we'll still go along.
1. 1. 1.
Group dynamics is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology.
1. 1.
So MacKenzie, I'm just about finished here, in case you're worried about timing. But I just want to point out as well that social norms like that peer pressure, it can also take different forms. And for instance, who better to tell you not to dump your bait than a guy like Bob Azumi, or somebody who is recognized as an expert in his field, in or her field. And so it's good to get those kinds of messengers as well. I'll just finish up by saying that these last three elements of commitment, reminders, and social norms they work together. As I said, they're bigger than the sum of the parts, and it's really important to that they work that you sort of meld them together in your design. And here's a really good example of doing that. This is the I Clean, Drain, Dry sticker that was developed by ISCBC, and I think the Canadian Council on Invasive Species is using it as well, and we're using it in Nova Scotia. And it is a reminder, because if somebody puts it on their boat or their trailer, or on, say, on the posts of the winch when they're pulling up the trailer, they're going to see that reminder to themselves to clean, drain, and dry their boat. It's also a public commitment. I talked about the strength of public commitments. If that's on your trailer or on the windshield of your boat, and there's a bunch of other people around you, they can see your public commitment, and that's going to make you more likely to do it. And finally, if there's enough of those stickers around that can help create the social norm, that people will look at it and say, oh, I guess I should be doing that as well. So I'm just going to skip my last couple slides here, and I'm just going to say that we looked at all of those different elements of behavior change. And the most important thing is you've got to use behavioral psychology. It's not enough just to educate if you want to make serious behavior change. That's my contact information. Feel free to contact me if you want. You can point your phone to that QR code if you're interested in subscribing to my behavior change newsletter, and you can always unsubscribe if it's not your cup of tea. Thanks, MacKenzie.
Thanks so much, Ken. I know we're a little bit out of time here, but I would like to hear your thoughts on Ontario's new boating regulations and how it's going to be, well, not going to be, it's now the law to have to clean, drain, and dry your boat when moving from water body to water body, and how you think that's going to impact behavior change.
Well, it's worked really well in Minnesota. Like in Minnesota, you have a big fine if you are transporting invasive species. It's not that you have to have clean, drain, dry your boat, but it's a big fine if you are stopped and you've got any invasive species in your boat. Also, you can't transport bait with the water from, like, if you're going to keep your bait, you've got to change the water. So that's worked very well. I've done quite a bit of work with Minnesota. We did a survey of anglers, and avoiding fines, they identified as a big motivator for why they clean, drain, and dry their boats.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your expertise and all of your great information that you shared. I think it's going to be really helpful for us to take away in our outreach work. So hopefully you'll get some new subscribers to your newsletter as well, so we can all learn some more as we go.
Well, thank you. And there's some really good speakers coming up in this next session that know a lot about this stuff, and I'm going to be listening, and I hope others will too.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And with that, I'll see you guys all back at 2:45, so in about 9 minutes. And we have our education, outreach, and community science session to close off our forum. So I will see you guys all back in about 10 minutes. Thank you.